So, hello and welcome, everyone. Jim and I have been having lovely conversations about herbs and life for years, and we decided this past year that we would occasionally do them in front of everybody. And so this is a conversation about the nervous system. Jim is going to be teaching with me and Mel next month down in Alabama about a specific um, kind of aspect of understanding the nervous system. And so I thought tonight we would have a conversation about what next month's class is going to look like and some of the topics, and also field some questions from the general public, which we have kind of a couple of pages already about the nervous system. So if any questions come up, feel free to type them in the chat box and we will attempt to answer them. So, hey Jim, how's it going?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Pretty good.
I'm behind on everything.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's that time of year, right? Like it's too much growth and abundance to stay up with everything.
Uh-huh. Yeah, there's a lot to stay up with, and also there's just too much stuff, which I think leads into the topic at hand, that there are so many different stressors, but one of the big ever-present stressors is just trying to keep up with the onslaught of all the stuff, because I think a lot of us don't live a lifestyle where we can rest and recreate as much as we would like to and need to.
Hmm.
I don't.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess maybe for the sake of the rest of the conversation, we should talk a little bit about what we mean when we say stress and stressors. So when I think about when I think about this complex topic that we call stress, I try to, in my head, keep in mind that not all things that are stressful are bad for us, and many of the you know fun things in life have an aspect of stress mixed in with them. And so, in research on stress and the stress response, researchers often try to differentiate between positive stressors, which they call eustress, and negative stressors, which they call distress. And then another subtle differentiation there is stressor versus eustress and distress. So a lot of things can be stressors on the body physiologically without evoking mental or emotional distress. Like a lot of exercise can be a physiological stressor on the body. And yet it doesn't cause the type of stress response that we might associate with fear or panic or anxiety.
Yeah, right.
And so even the words we use to talk about these complex topics have some significance in and of themselves and how we conceptualize it. So your
It,
beard's getting thick, Jim.
I just haven't got around to trimming it. I'm really not trying to compete with you. Hold on. Oh, hey, Thomas, my beard is as long as your beard is now.
Yeah, I know.
There's been times I've thought sometimes, I wish I could send people to adjective class, because I ask them how they're doing, and they'll, be like, oh, I've got a lot of stress. Like, can you describe yourself? So there's a lot,
Mhm.
a lot of what kind, like bad stress, and you want to know more than that, because I think, another dynamic that I like to look at is there's all the stress that is happening to us, which we cannot escape. And again, some of it is like really good. And even if it's not, good might not be the right word, we would think it's important,
Mhm.
you know, because stress is challenge, and challenge stimulates growth, right? Challenge stimulates change. And in some imaginary person's land, they live a life where they're not stressed out at all, then they don't have to grow and change as much, right? And some of the good stressors, like if I think about like probably my favorite, source of stress is probably Stephanie, who's upstairs. Um, she's awesome. I love her. She's the greatest thing in the world. And yet there's, navigating that relationship, being in a relationship with someone where at a certain point you both want different things and neither one of you is wrong. It's not about swaying the other person or convincing them to see your rightness.
Mhm.
Um, that creates stress. Then there's like societal stress and institutional stress and many things that happen to us. And then I think it's also sometimes really important to say like there are the things that are happening to us and there are our responses to that stress, which an assessment, which is an easy question to ask and a hard question to answer honestly, is like, is the way that I'm responding to this situation helping, or is it actually aggravating the situation and making everything like a little bit worse? You know?
So the idea that challenging things help us grow is something that I wrote about a fair bit in my Five Realms philosophy piece, and I termed it allostatic growth. I think
Hmm.
that allostasis is a really elegant model for examining the effects of, and the research is mostly on the effects of distress on the body and the nervous system. But there is also that positive aspect of adaptive, like stress demanded adaptive growth.
Hmm.
And so I wonder if maybe the idea, so you mentioned relationship stress. I wonder if maybe that idea is not appropriate for all of our relationships. Like in some of my closest relationships, the challenging moments have led to the most growth.
Hmm.
And I think that I can extend this past my relationship with people into my relationship with nature in general or plants. Like sometimes getting to know a new plant can be challenging and it can bring up stuff and it can make us feel. And also, at the other side of that is insight and growth and a deeper understanding. And so, in my mind, there is a huge role for relationship in allostatic growth, in expanding our ability to adapt and grow. I think the popular phrase for that is resilience. And so, yeah, I wonder if we can conceptualize our relationship with the non-humans in the same way that we do our close human friends.
Yeah, it might be like a lot of things, is like the closer they are to humans, the more we can relate. So if we like step down from like, our partner, maybe if we have one, or our children, if we have them, to like our pets, with dogs and their demands and their chewing up our couches, or,
Right.
um, creating expectations. But, I don't necessarily hear it as much as I used to, but I do remember like this ridiculous time when people were saying things like, "Oh, you just need to eliminate the stress in your life." And I'm like, "How is that going to happen?"
Yeah. Yeah. And if you could magically wave a wand and eliminate all of the stress, what would that do for personal growth?
Yeah, it would be like the most boring movie ever. Like if your life were a movie and there was like no stress and no challenge, and you're just like, "Oh, hey, everything's great. I'm
Now,
gonna
I
go."
mean, I also want to hold space for the idea of like, I spent 2 weeks in a hammock on Lake Adelon and had zero stress, and it was amazing. but also like at the end of that time period, I was bored and ready for something else. So
Mhm.
maybe periods of low stress or no stress can be really beneficial, but extended periods, maybe not so much.
Yeah, I think that a part of that is like recovery, right?
Yeah.
You know, like you're recovering from periods of high stress, you need a little bit more. And, you know, what I wish and what I strive for and sometimes do better than other times is like rather than high stress, high stress, high stress, oh, I need a break and escape everything, is to like really integrate into my lifestyle. Like, oh, I need to take breaks actually especially when I'm stressed out, you know, to say like, oh, I know I think that I can't take a 3 minute break from this deadline that I'm working on.
Right.
Really, I probably can. And if I did, I would probably be less stressed out and more efficient, and that would work in my favor.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that part of building health and resiliency is setting aside some intentional time for rest and restoration. Like we talk a lot about sleep hygiene, and I'm sure maybe we'll get into sleep later, but also there are a lot of non-sleepy things that can be really restorative to our sense of stress and nervous system. And making time for that is, in my opinion, a very essential part of building resiliency and nervous system health. So maybe let's intersperse our random musings with some of the questions.
All right. Do you have a
Uh,
favorite question?
I mean, I'm just going to kind of start at the top because it's also a really good one, and also David Winston showed up, so there's no way he's going to stay quiet in answering this one. What is a nervine herb that you think is often overlooked and should be utilized more? I think that's a super juicy one. What do you think, Jem?
Well, anytime there's a question that talks about herbs and it starts with a singular A, like as if I'm supposed to say only one.
Right.
And maybe if I'm going to just take one and elaborate to three, and I would say I think that Damiana is terribly underused as a nervine because everyone just pigeonholes it as an aphrodisiac herb and not as this really nice sort of like stimulating nervous system trophy restorative. I think it can fall into that category. um I think that this is maybe like in the US and North America more so than maybe in Europe, but Botanica or wood betony or Stakes, I feel like is this amazing plant that does really pretty awesome stuff that just seems less utilized here. And then as the really outside the norm one, I'm going to say that what I going after the eclectics just call cactus or night blooming cereus or Selena cereus grandiflorus, I think is a really good nervine um, for when people have like a lot of like really intense fear-based anxiety, you know. And I've been using that quite a bit in the last few years and just really like it because it's very effective, but also I think very gentle and supportive.
I have used more stackies since the pandemic than in like my entire career combined. I think that it has been a really amazing nervine and underutilized nervine for general like life pandemic stress, but also, and I think there's a question later on about this, it's an amazing remedy, at least symptomatically, for mild to moderate dysautonomia. And I see that more and more since the pandemic. But if we're going with overlooked and underutilized, I have two that I like here. One is lyre leaf sage, which is a southern folk remedy that has aromas similarly to sage, but much more mild, and seems to have a gentle, nourishing it's not milky oats and it's not skullcap, but it's like that with some aromatics that certain people I think find really beneficial. And then the one that surprised me maybe the most, I learned from our uh, blind tea tastings, which we've been doing for years and years. And at some point, and I don't know why, we decided to try epimedium, horny goatweed.
Hmm.
And I had always pigeonholed it as a circulatory remedy. But the first time we did it blind, everybody classified it as a nervine and as a pretty strong nervine that was very relaxing but not overtly sedating. And I thought it was maybe a fluke. And so I tried it by myself and was pleasantly surprised. And then year after year after year, epimedium has, in blind tastings, been shown to be a pretty potent nervine. I love it. I think it has a expansive, almost diffusive quality to it. It's a nervine that affects the not just the sensory system, but probably the circulatory system too. So those would be the two most underutilized, I think. David, what are your favorite underutilized herbs, nervine herbs?
Well, thank you. I wasn't planning to
I
contribute.
you know you're going to get put on the spot in any class you show up to.
I
You
just
you
wanted
you
to
should have
see.
changed your screen name and
I just wanted to see you guys, and uh, well, um, I think everything you mentioned is incredibly useful. I use all of them. Um, and I was just going to type in when you asked me that. I was going to just say that the Selenoceras, there's no Selenoceras grandiflorus in the United States. Everything is Selenoceras taranthus,
Mm,
which has the same activity.
mm.
You don't want to use the Peniaceras. They're much milder and nowhere near as effective, at least in my experience. Uh, I think a really underutilized, it's not an underutilized herb, it's underutilized as a nervine, is hawthorn.
Mm.
Hawthorn for disturbed Shen. I mean, if you know, it's like you were saying before, people say, and what's the one thing? And it's like if I had to use a single herb for ADHD in kids, and
Mm.
I would never use a single herb because it's way too complex for that. But if I had to use a single herb, it would be hawthorn in kids, like with ADHD, especially the solid extract. I think one other one, and then I'm going to just shut up because I want to hear you guys talk. Nobody came here to hear me talk, but celery seed.
Ooh.
Celery seed. The eclectics used it as a nervine, sort of a nervous system tropho-restorative stimulant.
Mm.
Especially, they used it a lot for both men and women for what they called sexual neurasthenia. It also lowers blood pressure. It enhances overall circulation. You just have to be careful how much you use because it can also irritate the urethra and bladder if you overdo it.
Wow.
So,
Yeah. Janet Kent has played around with a lot of different varieties and preparations of celery and sings its praises as a nervine tonic. And I think she said she got turned on to it because Herb Farm has a nervine formula with celery seed in it. It's one that I use celery seed for both respiratory and urinary stuff, but this is one maybe that I've pigeonholed and should explore more for the nervous system. Thanks, David.
sure.
there are so many plants. Sometimes when people say like, "Oh, you haven't used that one," and I'm like, "There's a lot of plants."
Right. I mean, several of these plants have distinct cardiovascular effects. And one of one of the things that can happen that can drive anxiety and even panic attacks is arrhythmias. And there's
Mhm.
a lot of different arrhythmias that can drive anxiety and panic. And they've done a lot of research as to like what came first, the chicken or the egg, because being anxious and having a panic attack can affect heart rate. But in most of the research, they seem to indicate that the change in heart rate, speed, or rhythm occurs before the onset of anxiety and panic. And so when I think about these nervine herbs that also affect the heart, I can't help but wonder if the plants are taking advantage of that bidirectional relationship.
Mhm. Yeah, I think sometimes with indications, I like the phrase caused or aggravated by, like anxiety caused or aggravated by tachycardia or arrhythmia, or heart irregularities that don't seem dangerous.
Yeah, there's a specific type of sudden onset and rapidly resolving ventricular tachycardia. And like 80% of the people that have that experience overt panic attacks with no psychological trigger. And when they go in and do a cardiac ablation and stop the arrhythmia, like 80% of the people have a permanent resolution of their panic attacks.
Mhm.
So
Right.
there's some really interesting bidirectional relationship. I mean, not just between the brain and the heart, but like the brain and the gut. And turns out that like it's all connected, right?
Yeah, I think, one thing that when I'm considering the different nervines, um, is what else are they doing? And so we could look at nervines like cactus or linden and be like, oh, these are calming nervines or nervine pro-restoratives in the case of cactus that have an affinity for like heart arrhythmias or hypertension or elevated blood pressure. And then we could look at like chamomile and catnip and be like, oh, these are calming nervines that are really good carminatives. And so one thing that I do when someone comes to me and they're dealing with anxiety is not just to be like, tell me about your anxiety, but like what other parts of your body are affected, Like is it more settling in your musculature? Is there some kind of cardiac or uterine or digestive? Is your asthma flaring up? Because that will help me to think like, oh, rather than thinking like I need a nervine to do this stuff and then I need some digestive herb to do this stuff, it's like, oh, what is a maybe, digestive nervine that is going to fit as many of the indications as possible. And I always feel like the more indications one particular herb is matching, the better fit that is going to be for that person. And usually the better it works. I mean, usually is a key word here, but I found that often to be the case.
Well, yeah, I mean, we talked at the beginning about stressors versus distress and eustress. When somebody comes in and they're in regular distress, they have you know, either what they would term chronic stress or what might or might not be diagnosed as anxiety. I think it's important to ask what are the physiological stressors going on in the body outside of this thing that you want to work on?
Mhm.
Because, having anxiety and IBS often go hand in hand. Turns out that, your gut's hurting and cramping and not knowing, like, if you can take a trip because of where the bathrooms are located.
Right.
That adds to your stress levels that worsen your anxiety. And so sometimes if we focus not just on the pattern of anxiety, but on all of the other stressors going on, we can see some pretty big shifts.
I agree.
Uh, let's let's follow up on that. Can a nervine herb infused oil applied topically directly affect the nervous system, aka herbal body oiling?
Yes. And my favorite example of this would be if you make a really concentrated kava kava infused oil, that definitely has effects beyond like the local skin and musculature to affect someone's nervous system and calm them down. And that's not even whole body oiling. That's just like getting one area. You can really feel that settle in.
I think my answer would be yes, sometimes, right?
Mhm.
Because like there's a lot of nervines that I don't think of as having a significant effect when applied topically, no matter how much you apply. Like, can you apply enough milky oats topically to fill anything?
Well, going back to the singular here, the question is, can a nervine herb, not can
Sure.
nervine herbs?
That's
So
true. Can a nerve?
I agree
Okay.
with your assessment. I'm totally with you. So they can, they don't necessarily. Um,
So it depends upon which compounds in the herbs are acting upon the nervous system, and do those compounds absorb dermally or not? And with the cavalactones, yeah. Um, with your tropane alkaloids, absolutely. You know, you can apply um, datura henbane and absorb substantial amounts of scopolamine, enough to affect thinking and your nervous system generally. So yes, some nervine herbs can, but just because an herb is a nervine internally doesn't mean that it will work when applied topically.
yeah,
That
it's
be
kind of
my
the same. It's kind of the same as like with antiviral herbs. Just because an herb is antiviral against a certain pathogen, it doesn't mean if you take it internally, it's going to cycle back around through the body and get there. Whereas if you put it on topically, it might. It just really depends on the plant.
yeah, yeah. So very plant specific, but there is at least one. There's multiple plants that you can apply topically.
Now I'm going to make like milky oats infused oil and
Try it. Yeah.
to find out. It might be the hidden thing that no one yet has tried out.
Yeah. Um, hmm. Okay. So, man, chat is really busy over here. And also we have our main questions that came in.
So I don't know. While you're looking, I can just ask you this question and you
Sure.
can think about it. We're mostly talking about herbs, but a question I get asked all the time is what I think about these topical magnesiums, like the magnesium chloride, magnesium oil. I could really kind of say my experience with that has been there's three general reactions to it that I see in roughly thirds, you know. One is people love it and they think it's the most amazing thing in the world. And then two is people try it out and they're like, I don't really know if I think I did anything. I don't know. And then the third one is, did someone just spray like powdered fiberglass grease onto me because my skin is all irritated and like this is not relaxing at all.
Yeah.
And that can be like in some cases I know people that have shared, the same preparation. So it's not like one was too concentrated or not, but more their constitutions, the sensitivity of their skin and the reactivity of their skin was more to that. But that's been something where I feel like it's pretty hit and miss. And I'm not sure, because I know there's a book that claims it, and I just can't get behind it, that you can spray magnesium on you and get your dietary magnesium like that. I just struggle with that.
I mean, I think that maybe this points towards a bigger problem in understanding the effects of anything on the nervous system, and that is that our expectations strongly influence our nervous system. And so, you know, even in anxiety and panic disorders, there's a substantial amount of placebo response. 30 to 40% of people, depending on the study, some even higher than that, will feel better no matter what they're taking because they have a new way to make meaning of what's going on in their body. They have a new way to feel more in control of what's going on in their body. I dislike the term placebo a lot.
Mhm.
I think that Daniel Moorman has some nice insights in his work on reframing the placebo response as the meaning response. Um, and so when we think about like does magnesium work topically? I mean, the first question is for what? If you're talking about for stress and anxiety, well, maybe. It depends on a lot of things. Will topical magnesium replete a known deficiency? Only studies that I've seen that show dermal absorption are funded by like topical magnesium companies.
Right, yeah.
And the quality is generally low and the study size is small. And I don't think if somebody came to me and said, my serum magnesium is low and they're afraid it's going to cause an arrhythmia, what should I do? I would not say slather down topical
Mhm.
magnesium. Okay. What about essential oils that can cross the blood-brain barrier and affect the limbic system? Yeah, I mean, the cool thing about essential oils is that they can affect the limbic system without any application at all. Just the smell of some essential oils can affect the limbic system. And it's very difficult to determine if the effects of a volatile rich plant are because it has crossed the blood-brain barrier and directly affected neurochemistry, or if the effect is indirect through olfaction. Um, so I think that aromatic plants in general tend to have an effect on the nervous system. And anything that smells nice is likely to induce a little bit of parasympathetic activity.
Mhm.
So I think that aromatics are lovely, and a lot of our most popular, like daily nervines, are those aromatics. I think we should be drinking buckets of Tulsi, right? It's such a pleasant and sustainable herb with the easy, demonstrable of positive effects on the nervous system and kind of general health.
Yeah, I agree. The aromatic plants, if you can find the one that works for you and the one that you like and that tastes good to you, and like have that be your sipping tea.
Yeah.
And Tulsi is such a great example of that because it's got a generally likable flavor like pink bubblegum, weirdly. That you can swing in a bunch of different directions depending on what you mix it with. You can make it more warming by adding cinnamon. You can make it a little bit more cooling by adding maybe some blackberry leaf. So there's a way to swing that. You can drink it hot in the wintertime and iced in the summertime. You can just throw Rosalie, I remember visiting her one time in Washington, and she just had, a big mason jar where she didn't even make tea. She just threw the flower tops that she was clipping off in there, and that was the water for the day. So it's a really incredible plant, and it kind of hits the sweet spot. It is aromatic, and so it's a little bit warming. It's probably a little bit drying, but not too much. It's highly unlikely to aggravate very many people. Not nobody, but very many people. And if someone said like, "Hey, like I started drinking holy basil tea and I like it. Do you think it's okay for me to drink like every day for the rest of my life?" I'd probably be like, "Yeah,
There's not many herbs that I would say that about. Holy basil
there's
is not
not."
one of them. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I do like Avicenna's insights into basil and the way that he considered it to be an exhilarant that inclines the heart towards joy and happiness. I think that's a nice way to think of holy basil or garden basil.
Yeah, I do like regular sweet basil as well.
Mm.
They are different, but I think that there's some overlap there, and it's more than just a culinary plant.
Right. Okay, shifting gears pretty drastically. Recommendations for neuro Lyme. So that is a nervous system question. I guess that is like all of those are open for
This is great
discussion.
to get like a really good easy one. So what I'm inclined to say is there's just so many considerations there that are so dependent on what's going on with the person and what the presentation is, um, that I could get lost trying to like think of all of the questions and everything without an actual person here. But I can tell a story about an inquiry I got from another practitioner that contacted me, and someone was having like really just kind of pretty horrible stabbing nerve pain related to Lyme and neuralgia. And they were wondering whether maybe I had any ghost pipe tincture. And I was like, I think I ran out of ghost pipe a couple years ago. I do think that that is a very valuable herb. I think it's a little bit hyped, maybe a little bit hyped as being like the thing or like, the top tier. And I think it's great, but I don't think that. And this is a plant that I might have learned about. I might have initially learned about this plant from someone who could be in a box on our screen. But I was like, oh, I don't have that, but have you perhaps tried sweet clover or mellow-lotus? It could be white or yellow sweet clover because those sort of like really intense, sharp stabbing nerve pain and really like anywhere in the body. I've used it for sharp stabbing uterine pain. I've used it for sharp stabbing bladder pain and interstitial cystitis. I've used it for sharp stabbing occipital migraines, so like peripheral neuralgia, that indication of it feels like someone got like an icon, plugged it into a wall and is poking you with it is like pretty specific to that plant. And I saw, we had this question written down, and I was like, oh, what they wrote me was really like pretty quote worthy, but I could not find it in the little bit of time I had to search for it. Um, so I can't say that, but it worked spectacularly. And for such a common weedy plant that actually does have a really long tradition of use, um, it's interesting because that would be another underutilized nervine if we take the word nervine and we go from sort of our like cognitive, mental, emotional states nervine and talk about like a nervine that's working on their physical nerves.
Right. Yeah. Uh, David, any insights into sweet clover?
Well, I was just trying to type it in, but it wouldn't let me type it in. Um, Mellow and St. John's wort is a starting combination for stabbing nerve pain, is simply brilliant. I mean, it is, I'm not, everybody, as Jim was just saying, you have to treat the person, not the disease. And when you're stuck treating diseases, your results are never going to be as good as if you treat the individual with their individual presentation, energetics, and constitution. But so I have somebody with stabbing nerve pain. The first two herbs I'm going to think about are sweet melilot and St. John's wort in combination.
Yeah, I think that's a great combo, and I also learned that from you and have used that combination for years. Uh, to answer this question, I think we have some herbal answers to this question, so I want to answer outside of that for a second, and first say that there are a lot of studies that show that 90% of people with neuro-Lyme improve with antibiotic therapy. So 20 to 30 days of doxycycline. It doesn't need to be any longer than that. And people improve for up to an entire year after antibiotic therapy. And about 10% of folks are left with post-treatment symptoms. I would also say that, so The recommendations for neuro-Lyme, make sure you've taken antibiotics. I would also say that the diagnosis of neuro-Lyme is one that is underdiagnosed in mainstream medicine and drastically overdiagnosed in alternative medicine. And so I think that if that diagnosis was made by a Lyme literate doctor or an alternative practitioner, before doing anything, you should go to a mainstream pathologist and have the diagnosis confirmed or refuted. Because I have seen so many people who did not have Lyme disease, who were inappropriately diagnosed with chronic Lyme disease or neuro-Lyme disease, and spent years and tens of thousands of dollars on treatment, and it turned out it was something else different. I was just having this conversation with a nurse practitioner friend, and like the last 10 cases that have come to me with a neuro-Lyme or chronic Lyme diagnosis had no objective evidence of having a Lyme infection to begin with. And in one of the cases, they were diagnosed with lupus eventually. In two of the cases, they were diagnosed with untreated sleep disorders, and that improved the symptoms that they had attributed. So Lyme is a really complex topic. And while we have herbs that can help with the symptoms of both acute and post-treatment Lyme disease, we also need to understand that the diagnosis is complex and that there's a lot of over and under diagnosis that needs to be considered. So, yeah, make sure you've taken your antibiotics, and then for residual symptoms, yellow sweet clover, St. John's wort, I think that depending upon the presentation of what those symptoms are, herbs can be dialed in and be really effective. Oh, extended thoughts on St. John's wort and its relationship to the nervous system, including energetics and internal and external use.
Okay, so what I think is interesting about St. John's wort is it is one of these nervines that crosses that bridge between affecting our cognitive, mental, and emotional states and our physical nerves, right? And probably more than a lot of the others, because there are some that are mostly mental, cognitive, emotional states and not so much physical herbs. And then, I mean, I really heard not many people call like prickly ash a nervine, although I think it has a strong action on the physical nerves. And I would say like outside of a specific contraindication for its use, and then maybe sometimes when there is one, with careful consideration, like if someone has nervous system distress that is both cognitive, mental, and emotional, and also physical nerve stuff, it's my go-to. And I think like probably a physical nerve trail restorative. It's a little bit warming, but not super, it's certainly not hot. It's maybe a smidge drying, but not likely to aggravate people. So I feel like energetically, it's got a nice mix of being both stimulating and relaxing together, but it's not too pushy on either end. And so I would call it warming and drying, but I would say it's not too far from temperate, so unlikely to aggravate people. And really just pretty wonderful. There is students ask me all the time, like, okay, so there are potential interactions with other drugs, and does that apply to topical use? And I think that the answer is like it's a lot less likely to apply with topical use, but I would not be able to tell someone, oh, absolutely, it cannot and never will be a problem, and you can completely rule that out because I don't think that there's an evidence base to make that kind of like absolute declaration.
Right. I remember a conversation with Howie Brownstein, and it was about St. John's wort and the effects of the TV show. I think it was ER. So I started herbalism in '96 and had only been studying for a few years when he talked about this phenomenon, or said, like, basically, I used St. John's wort for decades and never saw anybody have any problems with it. And then this TV show comes out, and in it, the person took St. John's wort and it messed up their birth control and they got pregnant. And within a month, people started coming to me with all types of problems from St. John's wort.
Mhm.
And
Well, do you remember like what in the early 2000s when it was the most popular supplement that anyone was taking, and it was like on the cover of magazines and being called Nature's Prozac, that there were just like hundreds of thousands of unplanned pregnancies? No, that actually didn't happen. Like I feel like, and again, I wouldn't rule out that that's a possibility. And if someone is using birth control and they absolutely want no risk or no thought of risk, right? Because sometimes correlation is not causation. But if you're retroactively thinking back about it, you're like, Jim said this would not be a problem. Um, I won't be responsible for any support payments. I'm not making any guarantees, but I just think like if it was a very likely thing, if it was like a lot closer to inevitability or this happens a lot, there would be a lot more citable real world cases. And I'm not saying there aren't any, but when you consider how popular that herb was, it's a little bit odd that it wasn't until we learned the mechanism of action and then we extrapolated like what is every single drug that's metabolized through this pathway. It's contraindicated with all of those,
right.
That it flared up.
One really interesting thing about all of that research on St. John's wort for depression that I haven't heard talked about is how poor the quality of St. John's wort they were using in the studies. So,
Mhm.
like, there are studies showing St. John's wort is as effective as SSRIs for mild to moderate depression, which honestly is not the claim that some people think that it is, since SSRIs are not much better than placebos, if at all, for mild to moderate depression anyway. But if that's the standard, then we look at the methodology of those studies. And I dug into it, and most of them were using St. John's wort in capsules that was like at least a year old.
Mhm.
And as herbalists, we like, so I am not of the opinion that you have to do St. John's wort fresh. A lot of herbalists are. I think that freshly dried makes an amazing preparation. But I think most herbalists agree that some level of freshness is essential for St. John's wort to do the things that we as herbalists know that it does. And yet, crappy 18-month-old encapsulated St. John's wort still works for depression. That's pretty freaking cool.
Yeah, and if you open up those capsules, or even if you go to a lot of like the commercial cut and sifted international bulk herb trade St. John's wort, you look at it and you're like, there's no green in there.
Right.
This looks like St. John's wort that's like kind of in the later process of having died back mostly.
Yeah. So I have learned a lot about the St. John's wort usages from modern pharmacology and SSRIs and research on the serotonergic system. I think that when we start affecting serotonin levels and serotonin receptors, a lot of times what we're doing is we're increasing neuroplasticity and adaptability. And so we can learn consciously and unconsciously better when our serotonergic system is like running well. And some of the really interesting research on serotonergics seems to indicate that they work by helping us mentally and emotionally and cognitively adapt to stressors or life circumstances. And so I think of St. John's wort as appropriate for a lot of folks going through big life transitions where an increased adaptive capacity is not just like helpful, but bordering on necessary. And St. John's wort and an African herb, kanna, are the two that I think of as having the strongest ability to facilitate emotional and cognitive adaptation. I also think that that allows them to be applied in scenarios that maybe they weren't traditionally used. Like in my practice, a lot of times when somebody develops a chronic illness, no matter the cause, their body not feeling like their body is one of the biggest sources of stress. It's an existential stress when the embodied experience feels foreign versus feels like you. I had my first major depressive episode a few years ago, and the most distressing thing was simply how my brain and body just didn't feel like themselves. There was an uncomfortableness that went along with that. And I found in my body and working with other people that if we can tweak the serotonin system and get it working a little bit more smoothly, even if our somatic experience will never return to what it was previously, we can learn to adapt to that new experience and remove the existential stress that goes along with disembodied feelings. I love St.
Yeah.
John's wort for that.
Yeah, I think that if we consider it as an aromatic plant and we think about the other stuff, like the other stuff that aromatics do in the body, the tendencies to sort of like disperse sluggishness and congestion and to like get things moving, is that when someone is in a emotional state, and I don't necessarily feel we have to use the word depression, right? But they're in a funk and they just can't see their way out of it and they feel stuck there. Um, and maybe, I don't know, it's just because of David's presence here. I keep thinking of David things, but like there's this thing, maybe you lost. I just think about this guy that I worked with a long time ago, and he worked for a company that supplied the auto industry when the big bubble collapsed and the auto companies needed to get bailed out, and they laid a ton of people off, and all the shops supplied them. Like people got laid off or shops just closed, and there was this guy, and he was not far away from retiring. He had a good job. It paid well. It was like, what he'd been doing. It was kind of like built into his identity. And then, not only get it laid off, but the whole shop closed. He couldn't get a job. He was never going to get a job being so close to retirement that's going to give him what that job was supposed to lead to. And he just, screw it. Like, I'm not going to look for a job. Nothing's going to happen. And, he was just in this stuck place. And, his focus was just on that loss, that thing that happened to him. And he couldn't do that. And, aromatics sort of disperse congestion, but they also sort of like kind of open up our perception to see other opportunities, other pathways, other possibilities. And that's always something that I'm thinking about when I'm using St. John's wort or other aromatic nervines. It's sort of like a key indication for me for a nervine that is aromatic as opposed to something that's maybe, let's say, bitter.
Okay, so I did a little bit of prep for this next question because it was super specific. And I thought, I haven't heard other herbalists talk about it, so I would. Would love to hear your thoughts on polyvagal theory and practice and connecting that with herbal medicine. Do people's personal energetics affect how the vagus nerve functions and how we regulate? What does regulation even mean? Is there good science supporting polyvagal theory yet? Or should polyvagal theory be considered a useful story that helps people regulate their lived experience and navigate the world, albeit through a different mechanism? That is a complex question. And I think I will start by saying that I don't think that polyvagal is a theory in the traditional sense of the word. In scientific theories, the purpose of the theory is to produce testable hypotheses, which you then test. And that is not what polyvagal theory is or does. It is, I think, better thought of as a framework to understand autonomic nervous system functions and effects. And I don't think that it is a physiologically accurate framework. Paul Grossman has written about multiple criticisms of the underlying neurobiology of polyvagal theory for like 15 years. And he has published several peer-reviewed articles on it in the last few years. And Porges has responded on his blog. He hasn't defended the theory in accepted journals yet. Paul Grossman is the guy. He is a world-renowned stress researcher, and he has written the most comprehensive critiques of polyvagal theory. I think that the few points that I would like to make about it are, number one, there is what's a good measurement to use here? There is a shit ton of bad neurobiology used to justify people's favorite practices or interventions. There's actually a great book that I recommend people read called Brainwashed: The Seductive Appeal of Mindless Neuroscience. And long story short, a lot of what you read that is published as books for lay people about how the mind works, how emotions work, a lot of this stuff is not based on quality science. And it's not explored extensively in the place where you would expect to see quality science explored. And so it's kind of like direct to consumer, oversimplified, speculative neuroscience. A lot of it, in my opinion, is an attempt to step into the void of loss of religion as a way to explain these very complex things going on, specifically with polyvagal theory and as relates to the vagus nerve in general. Here are my critiques. One of the primary challenges in studying the vagus nerve's influence on stress is the inherent difficulty in measuring vagal activity in real life situations. The only non-invasive way that we can measure vagal activity is by measuring respiratory sinus arrhythmia, which is a very imperfect proxy for vagal influence on heart rate. Respiratory sinus arrhythmia does not reflect vagal effects on other organs, all of which are innervated by the vagus nerve. And it has a number of limitations, even as an index of vagal control of heart rate. For instance, profound bradycardia is not, which is a big part of the freeze response in polyvagal theory, is not supported in the literature. And when it does occur, which is really rare and only in physiologically sensitive individuals, meaning they have heart issues already, it's likely mediated by the ventral, not the dorsal vagal mechanism, which contradicts the hierarchical association or assumptions of polyvagal theory. I think that, in fact, most of what we read about the vagus nerve is on extremely shaky or sparse science. There are the vagus nerve does clearly interact with the psyche and behavior, but its exact role in stress is really complicated and not fully understood. The various branches of the parasympathetic nervous system and even the distinct bundles of the fibers of the vagus nerve are active throughout the body, but they don't operate in unison. They are not operating simultaneously, synchronized or in parallel fashion. They show significant target organ specificity, which means that vagal outflow from the brainstem is different from one organ to another, which makes it impossible to generalize about overall vagal tone based on measurements of a single organ, the heart. Generally, vagal outflow to the heart slows the heart rate, while stress and panic tend to withdraw vagal activity, which increases sympathetic stimulation, raising the heart rate. But there are hierarchical autonomic assumptions in polyvagal theory that are unsubstantiated and overly simplistic. What does this mean about the various vagal hacks like humming or breathing exercises? While these techniques might briefly affect heart rate via the vagus nerve, studies show that the effects are really small, like a 1 or 2% difference, which is not thought to be clinically significant. And it is much more likely that the expectation of benefit from the exercise does more than the effects of the exercise on the vagus nerve. So I have I have a lot of thoughts about this. It's something I've been slowly writing about for a couple of years, but I don't think that polyvagal theory is well supported. I once, before exploring it deeply, adopted polyvagal theory. In my practice, I did not find that it was especially helpful. I've seen cases of people who I've seen 5 cases so far of people who believed they were experiencing the freeze response in like a la polyvagal theory, and they were really into that. And they thought they were experiencing a freeze response because they thought that they were experiencing traumatic disassociation. And in 5 cases so far, the dissociative experiences were actually secondary to undiagnosed neurological or sleep disorders. So it turns out that if you have narcolepsy and halfway fall asleep in the middle of a conversation, it looks a lot like you're in a disassociated state. Because you're half asleep. That is not caused by a trauma response. It's caused by a brain problem called narcolepsy. I'm not saying that it could not be caused by a trauma response. I'm saying that the literature doesn't support that in humans and barely supports that in animal studies. And in my practice, I have not seen polyvagal theory lead to the types of positive results that people hope for. So that's what I got.
I'm so glad you said all the complicated stuff.
What now?
I said, I'm so glad you said all the complicated stuff.
Yeah.
You know, 'cause a thought that I have on it is, I don't know that the physiology pans out. And that's the short version of what Thomas said. But also I can think about, people are really into it and they're often really attached to it. And I can think about like, what are other examples of where the physiology doesn't pan out, but I can still like find something. And I love in the question, it says, could it be considered a useful story that helps people regulate their lived experience, right? And that's like what we can work with, so like if someone comes into me and they're super into polyvagal theory, and they bring the chart and everything, and they're like, this is what's happening and that I'm like, oh, okay. And I might say something like, I know about it, it's not really quite the model that I use, but I see the pattern that you're saying. Because what I don't want to do, because I feel like when we're working with people, that one of the most important things we do is establish a therapeutic relationship where it's like, oh, okay, I maybe meeting this person, like I trust this person. I'm going to give this person like my time and energy and attention and intention. And I don't want to like start off that relationship by being like, oh, you believe this, and this is with a lot of things people come to me that they're invested in that I'm not so much invested in. And that idea of like finding the story in it instead of like working, because the way that the person has thought about this is telling me about what's going on with them. They're telling you they might be interpreting it differently than I would, but I can also think to other important in my practice sources of information that are physiologically inaccurate. Like I like Greek humoral medicine, and in Greek humoral medicine, your blood gets pumped from one ventricle to the other ventricle, and I can tell you, you shouldn't do that. It's a bad idea. That's not something we want to happen. It doesn't completely mean like, oh, we gotta like humoral medicine got the physiology wrong. There's nothing we can find here. And I really like physiomedicalism. And when I read Thurston, my head
Pull your
scrunches
hair
up.
out.
Yeah, my head scrunches up, and I'm like,
Oh,
I'm gonna have to.
that's your problem, David. I just realized it. You tried to tackle Thurston.
So I'm reading like Thurston's philosophy of physiomedicalism, and he was really trying to integrate physiomedicalism into this kind of burgeoning understanding of the nervous system. And so he took his ideas, and the ideas kind of like they're functional ideas. They're therapeutic ideas that are based on people who have problems and giving them herbs, and coming up with workable situations. And we created a physiology around that
Mhm.
that like, yeah, it didn't always pan out,
Yeah.
right? And so that's kind of where I'm at with polyvagal theory, and or other things that people come to me and they're really into is like, okay, this is, like a new thing. And, what is it like, what is it about this that's resonating with the person? That is usually the piece of information that is going to be most useful to me,
Right.
of like, oh, I've got this thing happening and I found something that I think explains it. And then I can be like, oh, okay, so that's what they want explained.
Right.
And then is it that? What are the other things it could be? And then, how can I help to be like, oh, um, I see that polyvagal theory might frame it in this way, but let's also look at this and see whether that could be the case.
Yeah. I'm working on an article right now that tries to explain what I'm about to attempt to in hopefully much better words. But I think that the history of medicine is filled with examples of really elegant descriptive diagnoses, right? Like we have observed patterns of suffering for thousands of years and documented them. And also, we have matched descriptive diagnoses, whether that is excess of black bile or a deficiency of spleen qi. We have associated these descriptive diagnoses with interventions that we have observed work. The problem lies in when we conflate a descriptive diagnosis with an etiological diagnosis. So it's, a very similar conflation between correlation and causation.
Mhm.
If we describe something as hot and red and painful, and we match an intervention to that, we have, and it works, we have an effective system. The problem lies in when we think that that matching allows us to understand the cause. So the cause can be multifactorial. You can have pain, and modern medicine uses descriptive diagnoses. Still, arthritis is a descriptive diagnosis. It is a doctor repeating back to you in Latin what you said in English. My knee is painful and swollen and red. And he says, aha, you have arthritis. It's just a translation of a description. It doesn't say what caused that. It doesn't say this is rheumatoid arthritis. It doesn't say this is gouty arthritis. It doesn't say this is osteoarthritis. It just says this is arthritis. It is a description, and we match an intervention to that. Etiology is another thing that I think needs to and should be explored more. And I see this so much in traditional medicine, mainstream medicine, and alternative medicine. You and I, Jim, have talked about adrenal fatigue. It's not a real diagnosis in that it is not an etiological diagnosis. People's adrenal glands don't become fatigued from stress and unable to produce their hormones. But it is a descriptive diagnosis of what a lot of people experience when they're chronically stressed out. The problem is in conflating description with etiology. Anyway, I'm trying to write about that, and it's kind of complex.
Yeah, I mean, the tendency here is that when we have an etiological description, and we say, oh, my adrenals, my adrenals, my adrenals, or maybe it's a digestive issue, and we're like, I have candida, and then we're like, oh, I need, like, my therapeutic goal is my adrenals, or my therapeutic goal is the candida.
Right.
And if that part of the physiology isn't right, then all of a sudden your therapy, your strategy, your protocol might be aimed at a place that it's not going to be the most effective.
Exactly. Yeah. And so with polyvagal theory, I think that it describes a lot of phenomenon that is very complex. Why do some people freeze up? Why do some people fawn? I love Porges coining the concept of neuroception as this idea that we are programmed to neurologically seek safety. I don't know that it's well supported, but it is, I think, a helpful way to make meaning of certain types of stress responses. And there's a lot that I think is helpful in that descriptive world that the physiology doesn't pan out and support it as an etiology, but that doesn't totally negate, like, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are good things that we can learn, even when it turns out that there's not a hole between the ventricles of the heart, like humoral medicine says. Okay. I have been having internal vibrations, a constant buzzing feeling, and pins and needles in various parts of the body. No neurologist has found anything on an MRI or blood test. Nervines don't help. Any other thoughts on what could cause the nervous system to buzz? Um, yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts on that. And my most pressing thought I want to get out is find another neurologist and make sure that they have done their due diligence, because there are common serious neurological issues that can lead to that. For instance, a B12 deficiency can lead to that. And if The only test for B12 that was done was a serum test, and they didn't check methylmalonic acid, then they should. You can have normal serum B12 and elevated methylmalonic acid, and who cares about the serum? The methylmalonic acid is literally poisoning your nerves. So you need to get enough B12 to force recycling of the methylmalonic acid in. So I have seen that as a common cause of buzzing sensations. I have seen lupus as a common cause of buzzing sensations. I've seen multiple sclerosis as a common cause of buzzing sensations. I've seen neuro-Lyme disease as a common cause of buzzing sensations. The weirdest case of buzzing sensations that I saw was a guy that was convinced that he had parasites crawling throughout his body, and he could feel them moving under his skin, especially during full moons. And for years, he tried everything, and pharmaceutical parasite remedies and herbal parasite remedies, and he'd done everything. And in our very first appointment, as part of several things that I said to him, said something to the effect of, when was the last time you went to a dentist? And we worked on other things and never got anywhere. And about 6 months later, he had a toothache and went to the dentist for the first time in 30 years and had x-rays, and almost every tooth had an infection under it. And he literally had every tooth in his mouth pulled. And within a week, all of his neurological sensations cleared up. It wasn't parasites at all. It was his nervous system freaking out because of chronic pockets of bacterial infection. So I've seen all types of weird things lead to buzzing sensations, and there's not like an herb for that. And even if there were, we wouldn't give it because that we've not identified the cause, and we don't want to palliate a symptom without also digging for the cause, especially when the cause could be serious. That would be my thoughts. Jim, you ever seen any weird buzzing?
I've actually been dealing with this for like the last 6 years, and I will say that if you're in a induced coma for several weeks,
28 days.
yeah, it's a bummer, and there are many lingering after effects, and there's a condition that is well established and too rarely talked about called PICS, or post-intensive care syndrome, that is this wonderfully horrible mix of like PTS, post-traumatic stress, and physical and cognitive nerve damage that happens as a result of sort of like not necessarily the thing that puts you into the ICU, but being in the ICU and the interventions that are taken. And I think, having been experiencing it, for about 6 years now, it's definitely not awesome. I would use not awesome as a really good descriptor. But I think about all of the people who were in the ICU as a result of COVID and who survived, and many of these people I know about, even if they're not clients, who get out and they're like, what in the world? Like, I feel like I came back to like a different body, like I feel like, oh, there's a bunch of stuff that isn't working right, or maybe it is localized. Maybe there's peroneal nerve damage, where the sciatic nerve branches at your knee down into your feet or in different places. And that's really common. And yet most people that I know, if they are that have been through the ICU, no one ever tells them about it. No one ever says like, oh, after this happens, there's these really common things that happen to people. So if this happens, it's because of the interventions that were taken. They're left to sort of figure that out, or maybe not figure it out and struggle with it, or find some of the information themselves. So I don't know, there are obviously people who have this going on for many different reasons, but that is a sort of like under-recognized situation. And for people who have survived traumatic illness, um, post-traumatic or the post-intensive care syndrome is really common and remarkably underdiagnosed. Most people receive no treatment for it. Most people don't even know it's a thing. And so kind of being aware of that and sort of like literate in that and some of the implications can be really helpful because you can help to contextualize sort of some of what people are going through. I wish I could say that I figured out something that works great for it. It's certainly not helped by being stressed out. That tends, like it is to many different conditions, to be an aggravant. But it is something that I knew of cases where it can linger. And when I've looked for research into that, and you try to find any research on the impact of the intensive care after 5 years, it's kind of like there's not a whole lot to find. They haven't been doing many long-term studies to look at that and see what the lingering implications are.
So lots of stuff can cause internal vibrations, and it's really complicated. And I hope that you can find a good herbalist to work with to help you identify your particular cause, whoever wrote this question. 2 questions about the nervous system. How are hand tremors related to the nervous system, and how is ringing of the ears related as well? And I would say that everything is related to the nervous system. Like that's how our brain controls everything. And so to bypass trying to talk about the physiology of all the different branches of the nervous system, I'm going to say, regardless of the cause of hand tremors, one of the things that I have found exceptionally helpful for a lot of people is blue vervain. And we have another question about essential tremors, and that's where I think that blue vervain shines the brightest. Although I currently use I have a client right now with Parkinson's, and they also respond to blue vervain. The problem that I have found with blue vervain and essential tremors or hand tremors in general is that the dosage, some people take, half a milliliter, a quarter milliliter, and it works, and that's great. But for other people, the dosage necessary to have an appreciable effect on the shaking hands is also the dosage that can trigger nausea. And so I think that combining blue vervain with ginger, I like ginger and cardamom with blue vervain if I'm going to give it in doses higher than about a milliliter and a half or 2 milliliters. So if I'm going to give somebody like a 5 ml dose of blue vervain, I'm probably going to also give them some ginger and cardamom to go with it. Jim, thoughts on hand tremors?
Well, I want to stick with the vervain in that I right now my current experience has been, if it's a verbena genus plant, all the verbenas that I've tried have worked pretty well. And although I've met some people, well, there's in the US, in North America, there's a pretty strong like, oh, but I want blue vervain. So if someone comes to me and they're like, do you have any blue vervain tincture? And I say, no, I have white vervain, Verbena urdicifolia, and they'll be like, I really want I really want blue vervain because that's the one. And I always think that's the one that we're using based on indications largely developed for European vervain. So we're already sort of like one step removed. And I know that Michael Moore used to say in regards to the Southwest vervains, verbenas that, he found them to have a lot of overlap, interchangeable. That maybe doesn't work the greatest because all plants have their unique personalities. But I have used blue vervain, I've used European vervain, I've used white vervain or verbena ursifolia. I've at least tasted hoary vervain. And I know that the southeastern verbena Braziliensis, Brazil, it might grow by you because learned about it from Suzanne Marinowski. Seems to fit a lot of those indications too. The one verbena that does not fit here would be lemon verbena because it's not a verbena.
Right.
Like lemon verbena is the common name, and it's not in the verbena genus. It's an aromatic plant, and so it doesn't have that same kind of overlap. But I found white vervain to be really pretty spectacular, to covering a lot of those bases. And depending on where someone lives, white vervain may be a lot more accessible to them than blue vervain.
I used Verbena brasiliensis, which we just call ditch vervain, for a decade before I realized that I wasn't using blue vervain because I wasn't taught botany, and I'm still not good at it. It's amazing. It grows everywhere over, across the South, and I think that, I mean, I'm biased, but I think that it's maybe slightly stronger than blue vervain. I think an amazing remedy. I've used white vervain a little bit, but maybe you turned me on to that, Jim. You
It
remember?
could be.
Yeah.
I like to sing its praises.
How can you regenerate nerves? I recently had hip replacement and still feel numbness on the outside of my thigh. So maybe the first question is, can you regenerate nerves? And I think the answer to that is maybe sometimes.
Mm.
I have seen people that had severe nerve injury make miraculous recoveries. I vividly remember seeing a lady in 2000, let's see, it was when I was a traveling herbalist, and I would do a 3-state circuit, like a week in each state, and come home. And it was in Mississippi, so that would have been 2003 or four. And this person had been in a car wreck, and a vertebra in their back had ruptured and sliced through their sciatic nerve, and they had been in constant, unrelenting pain for years. This injury had happened maybe 5 years before I met them, and they were taking OxyContin for pain relief, and they were in a wheelchair because the pain was just so great. And 2003 or four, I didn't know shit about shit, and yet somebody needed help, and so I used concentrated valerian and St. John's wort, and in 2 months, they were out of the wheelchair, off their strong opioids, and pain free. I think that herbs can have an amazing effect on nerves that just don't make any good sense as to how they have this effect. And also, I have seen people with what I thought was a mild injury leading to nerve damage do everything and nothing work. So, can you regenerate nerves? I think the answer is yes. How and what can speed that process up or assist it becomes a lot more complicated. St. John's wort is, I think, a reasonable starting place. And Jim, while you put your thoughts together, David has some thoughts, I think. Uh-oh.
Okay.
Or maybe he was waving by. I thought he was waving.
Okay. I would say that if I'm thinking about something that is reparative, St. John's wort I put into like a physical nerve trophorestorative. So it's not just improving function, it is having a restorative and a reparative effect. Um, and as you said, that doesn't mean that that will always happen every time anyone takes it. But it has that potential in it. Um, and I feel like repair and restoration of function falls into a different category to me than if I think about regenerating, like growing new nerves. And that is like, St. John's Wort might do that too. I'm not really sure. Sometimes I think Sometimes I think about the nerves is like your car when your battery dies. So like, you get in and you turn the key and nothing happens, and that's like numbness. Or you turn the key and you get like tick, 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 but it doesn't turn over. And that's like sort of that pins and needles tingly sensation. And all of the wiring is there. There's nothing that's broken. It's just like kind of like lost its charge. It's lost the flow of the nerve force through there. And in those situations, I might try something like prickly ash. Um, I might try, and I'm a huge fan of this, and I've seen it do amazing things. It's a bit of a hard sell, but like stinging with nettle, I think that that can be really amazing. Um, is a way to sort of like wake up those nerves and get them firing and get movement and activity happening through them again. And that's kind of like the big jump start, you rather than hooking it to another car and cranking the thing, you just sting it with nettle, or you walk through a nettle patch, or you can run your hands across it. Depends on where it's at. And where that needs to be done, might be relevant, because if you have something down in your feet that is originating from your spine, we might not only just sting our feet where we're not getting the sensation, but also the spine. In terms of regenerating nerves, I know this is an area that, Thomas is almost certain to have more scientific information than I do. I know the herb mushroom that everyone talks about is lion's mane, and I feel like potential, but from the last deep dive I did into it, which is a few years ago, it seemed like there was more extrapolation than actual studies showing like, oh, you're growing you know, new nerve cells, and you just grow them back.
I mean, that's also 99% of studies on herbs and supplements too. Um, yeah, so I think lion's mane has potential. There is quite a lot of preclinical evidence from petri dishes and animal studies, and there are enough human reports to make it plausible. Also, the compounds in lion's mane responsible for neurogenesis are very minor constituents. They are not in high concentration. There's two different families of compounds. One's found in the mycelium, one's found in the fruiting body. Both are alcohol soluble, not water soluble. So I think if you're going to try lion's mane, you should consider trying a concentrated ethanol extract of both the mycelium and the fruiting body. I have no idea where you can get that, and it's too much of a pain in the ass for me to regularly make. So maybe big doses of mycelium and or fruiting body would be an alternative, but I think it's going to take like multiple grams multiple times a day to get enough of those constituents to have a chance at sparking neurogenesis. A lot of serotonergics seem to have that potential, St. John's wort being the most common of those. Um, lithium, low-dose lithium orotate, has some potential for sparking neurogenesis because it increases brain-derived neurotrophic factor and other neurological neurotrophic factors. There's more than just the brain-derived. So I think that there's several things that can be tried. Also, once again, I have seen people throw everything at nerve damage and not have success. So it's not a guaranteed at all. Catnip for stress IBS. I wrote in the book about it being best as fresh, and now I talk about things being best as freshly dried, wondering if my opinion has changed. Yes, and also I'm not ready to arrive at conclusions yet. So like a fresh tincture of catnip works. So I think that a slightly dried or wilted extract might be a little bit more potent, and a fully dried might not be as good as a half dried, but I'm still playing with it and running experiments. So I currently use it fresh and wilted, and have not transitioned to using it freshly dried yet, but might, depending upon how my experimentations go.
Yeah, catnip is one of those herbs that it loses. Like it is not oregano. It does not stay like great for a long time. Even if you dry it and you like, if I dry my catnip myself
Mhm.
and it's perfect, a year later I can tell a significant difference in the quality of the dried herb. So I don't know that I've ever found commercial dried catnip that I was even remotely impressed by. And not that it doesn't work at all. It's just not comparable. It loses that the skunky part of its aromatics,
Yeah.
which are more sedative in nature. In William Cook's Physiomedical Dispensatory, he's got a recipe that I just ogled for a long time, and it's essence of anise. So that, I guess at the time would have been like a tincture then distilled, and nowadays would be like essential oil diluted in ethanol, um, valerian tincture, and a catnip succus.
Mm. Okay.
So I had a student of mine who I will teach, and I'll do an herb walk, and then the following Saturday she'll a student slash employer slash friend, one of those people. She'll do like a medicine making class talking about some of the plants that I did. And she's like, I want to make something different than, another tea or another salve or oil or something. And I was like, oh, I don't have one of the cranky wheatgrass juicers because at the time I was waiting for wheatgrass juicing not to be popular anymore, so someone would give me one, which totally happened, by the way. I'm also waiting for freeze dryers to become not popular anymore. So if you brought a freeze dryer and you realize you're not using it, you want to get rid of it. Um, that's my next thing. But I got one of those crank ones. But before I had it, she's like, I made it. And on the Thursday that I was over there teaching before the Saturday she's doing her class, she's like, have you had this yet? I'm like, no, I haven't had it yet. She's like, you have to try this. And I had a spoonful of it, like freshly juiced because juices oxidize really quickly. They need to be stabilized with alcohol or frozen. Uh, Otherwise, they're not good for very long. Um, and wow, I have never had any kind of catnip preparation make me so immediately like,
Oh,
yeah, and you can imagine what it takes to do that to me, right?
yeah.
Like that's not an easy thing to happen.
I
I
didn't
was
think catnip is a heavy hitter, but wow.
yeah, it was really like because I always thought is catnip is like it's very effective, but it's still kind of gentle. It's not super forceful. This was definitely on the more forceful end of like it really pushed me into being more sedated than calmed. And the effect didn't last, it wasn't like it lasted for hours, but when it kicked in, it was really pretty impressive. So that is if you have a juicer and not one of the spinny ones, but something that's appropriate for green plants, and you can try that out. I think it is totally worth doing. Um, I think catnip might fall into the underutilized nervine because even though everyone knows about it, I feel like it's kind of pigeonholed. It's like, oh, that's what you would give to kids. Like you would give that to children if they're stressed out or they can't sleep or they have some kind of GI thing. But because you would use it for kids, if there's like some, big burly person, with a lot of discomfort, it probably wouldn't be, strong enough for them. And I find that it's really wonderful. And I find that it's nerviness can be helpful for people who, when they get stressed out, they've got gut troubles, or for people who are stressed out by their gut troubles. So if they're gassy and crampy, if that's sort of like caused or aggravated by their stress and anxiety, um, if when they get really worried or stressed out, they think they're going to vomit. So like that nervous stomach, like, oh my gosh, I feel like so stressed out. Now I feel queasy. Now I feel like I might throw up, which never makes anyone feel more relaxed, I think. Um, and then the other indication I used for it is um, like if when people get overexerted, like they've overextended themselves and the direction that they go to, um, it's not whiny and it's not cranky. It is just like kind of hypomanic, like hyperactive child mode, whether they're a child or not. But right, we can imagine the child who, when they sort of like miss their sleep window, they just get wild, you know. And I think for people that are not getting enough sleep and they're like, oh, but like I hit this point and I'm like, I have all of this energy, but it's sort of like a nervous energy that they can't focus and direct, that it's very good for that too.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you tried cat mint?
I have not.
I had a student who found a lot of benefit from fresh catnip while they were here, and they went home and didn't have any catnip, but had like an abundance of this cat mint, which is less valerian-y and more spearminty, but
Mhm.
like the valerian still comes through. And they got the same benefits at about a quarter of the dose. They thought it was much more potent, and I've played with it in a couple of cases, and it's really similar in action. And I think it might be a little bit more potent too.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I don't remember the specific variety, but the mints are just so great for the nervous system.
Yeah, the mints are pretty wonderful. There's a lot of them.
What ideas for kids less than 9 years old with high energy and impulsivity?
Could be catnip.
Could be catnip. I was going to say a mini trampoline, but maybe catnip is good. Uh, I have seen so many kids that when they intentionally and oftentimes drastically increased their exercise, it helped their focus and energy and mood and sleep and everything. And so the first thing that I think about in response to that question is how can they move their little bodies more?
Yeah. Having been that kid, and maybe still slightly being that kid, yeah, having a discharge is really good. If I were to go back to like Greek or Unani humoral theory, we would think about people with a more dominantly sanguine temperament, sort of like the Tigger, of the bunch. And the best way to aggravate that temperament is to try to get them to be still, to sit still and listen and don't fidget. And that can be really challenging. If a kid is maybe going to more conventional schooling and they, have a teacher that wants them to sit still or doesn't want them, tapping their hands or tapping their feet or fidgeting or, just being really active in class, Um, and in those situations, it's like, okay, so um, there's not inherently anything wrong with the way that, and I'm not sure about this particular instance because I don't know all the details, but sometimes it's like there's nothing wrong with the way the child is behaving. It's just they need to be more physically engaged to learn, and sitting still is hard for them. Um, but maybe sometimes like we have to do what I call damage control, which is like, and I feel like in our culture, I often also have to do damage control. Like, oh, really? You don't need to change. You're totally fine. But unfortunately, the society around you isn't very friendly to your natural way of being. And so, like, now we do have to maybe use herbs that are like going to be like more calming in nature. Um, I would think about, ensuring good nutrition. I would think like it might be aggravated by omega-3 deficiencies or magnesium deficiency. I'm almost always with actually any kind of nerving, anything going to think about milky oats. But I might think about like milky oats and catnip, maybe lemon balm together. That sounds really pretty wonderful and gentle to me. Um, but it's going to be with the caveat of like where do they have space to have that release of all of their immense energy, vital force, chi, prana, call it what you will.
I would also say that ADHD is a real thing, and there are really strong genetic links, and the neurobiology research indicates that some people have less nerve innervation into the control centers of the brain. And so it takes a louder signal for them to exert control. And stimulants, by raising norepinephrine in the brain, increase that signal strength. And humans have used psychoactive stimulants to help with focus, executive functioning, and impulse control for thousands of years. Caffeine, nicotine are like, you know, coffee, tea, and tobacco are some of the most popular plants in the world for a reason. They have significant effects on our brain chemistry, our thoughts, and behavior. I don't think they're appropriate for a 9-year-old, at least not the nicotine. Maybe small doses of green tea, depending upon the kid. But sometimes we need to focus on practices or herbs that increase norepinephrine in the brain. Intense exercise is a great way to do that. There are a lot of herbs that probably also work in a similar way. I finally finished an article last month that I've been working on for a few years called like the appropriate use of stimulants. And I think that sometimes we try all of the things with kiddos and still we live in a world that demands more. And small doses of stimulants are sometimes appropriate to help with impulsivity and executive function
Mm.
and
I
or
think
and adult
David also mentioned Hawthorne,
Hawthorne. Yeah.
and I think that like Hawthorne and Schizandra
Mhm.
and Milky Oats is kind of a nice, gentle thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Shizandra is a pretty common recommendation when I work with kiddos that are like that. It actually it is not bad. I'm not gonna say it's good, but it's not bad as like a one-to-one glycerite.
Mhm.
The sweetness offsets all of the other flavors, and kiddos normally find it fairly tolerable. A trick for kids and herbs is have the parents take doses in office with you so the kids can see it. I find that kids are much more likely to do something if the parents are open to doing it.
Yeah, yeah, there's a thing, I've had young kids for a long time, and parents would say some kids just don't want to take stuff, so that's real. But like, there's also, if you're like, Thomas, I want you to take this, and like, if the parent seems nervous,
Right.
and if the child doesn't see the parent drinking tea or taking stuff out of a bottle, and it's like some unusual thing that is only doing to them, and they pick up on some kind of hesitation or expecting a conflict and all that, like, and if it can be sort of like, oh, it's depending on your child, like, oh, it's potion time, like, let's make potions, and there's also a lot to be said for a good chaser.
Yeah.
Like, a good chaser is pretty incredible.
So I have, on a handful of occasions, used a strategy that I think I'm just going to call it could be worse. And it's got to be just the right type of kid. Like you need to understand kids' personalities before you try this. But in a very memorable case, I had a kid who was just like not going to take anything. And so I said, have you ever had a fart so stinky that you just wanted somebody else to smell it because it was so bad, like you needed validation that it was that bad? And he said, yes. And I said, I have the herbal equivalent of that. It is so bad
Nice.
that I want everybody to try it. I'll try it with you if you're up for trying it. And they said they laughed because I talked about farts in front of their parents, and they said, okay, yeah, if you're gonna try it, I'll try it. And so I, went to the apothecary and grabbed andrographis, and came back and took a dose of andrographis and like shuddered and made a face, and then said, "You want to try it?" And they said, "Yeah." And they shuddered and they made a face, and God, this is so awful. And it was just like the worst thing ever. And I said, "See, I told you this was like the stinky fart equivalent of herbs." And also, the herb that like I think would work really well for you if you took it every day doesn't taste nearly this bad. Do you want to try it? And they said yes. And they tried a schizandric glycerite, and as compared to andrographis, it's not nearly as bad. And they went from totally resistant to taking herbs to like being open to taking herbs because I brought some silliness and a little bit of it's not that bad comparison into the conversation. Kids are fun.
Yeah,
And
I'll have to totally try working some silliness into what I do.
do you use the props like your teaching props when you see kids?
Oh, I haven't had the opportunity to yet, but Mel made me this wonderful Finley Ellingwood.
Ellingwood, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, this would come out for sure. Oh yeah, totally. The castle or whatever. Um, yeah, I think that, yeah, if they can see that you're, um, again, it's that therapeutic relationship, right? So you connect with them, and it's not like, oh, there's this person, they're mostly going to talk in front of me about me to my parents, and that feels weird. And if the interaction can be, between you and a child, it just helps. And whether it's an adult or a child, I always feel like in whatever language works for the person, the more we can kind of explain like a version of our reasoning
Mhm.
and why we're doing something and why it makes sense so that they get it and feel included, I think that helps with follow through.
There are lots of kids and teens with anxiety. What are some of the best herbs you have used to help support and regulate their nervous system? Most common problems are social anxiety, overthinking, and panic attacks. What's your approach when dealing with young clients with these issues? So we talked about a lot of herbs already that I think can help. I'm a big context person. For me, context is really important. I would say that there are there's no type of anxiety caused by a deficiency of herbs. And so we should understand that herbs that help the nervous system don't replace the need to grow your self-regulation skills, your self-soothing skills, to understand more about your mind and body. I have found therapy to be an amazing place and way to explore all of those things. I started therapy as a teenager and have been in and out of therapy my whole life. And each and every time I engage with it, I learn more about myself and how to regulate my nervous system better. And so for me, the number one recommendation would be somebody that the kids could learn self-regulation skills from, somebody that they could express troubles and problems with. And herbs are a really nice addition on top of that, but they don't replace that in my practice. What do you think, Jim?
Well, I have a thought, and it's a little bit heavy. It may not apply, but it might apply, and it's important, is that could be younger kids, could be older kids, but let's just say tweens, because I think the word tweens, or it's just teens is used here, is that sometimes if there's social anxiety, right, or panic attacks, it just makes me wonder, not to conclude, but wonder, like, is something going on? Like, is there maybe bullying going on? Is there some kind of dynamic that's happening that is like underlying that, right? Is there conflict within the friend group? And depending on the relationship people have with their kids, and depending on even if you have a great relationship with your kids, depending on a certain kid's disposition, they may be more inclined or not inclined at all to really quite communicate what's going on, right? If there's conflict in their friend group or if there's something that's making them very uncomfortable. And so having something that could be therapy, which would be great, or could be sometimes like another trustworthy person who's maybe not their parent that they have that they can go to instead of like communicate with and talk about that. I mean, it's a kind of hard thing if that's not established to make that happen. But if that dynamic is already there, if there's a cool uncle or family friend or, grandparent or someone else, because I know of situations where um, someone was, having a lot of symptoms or issues or presentations that was really distressing and they wanted to work around. And there was like a really big thing behind it that had happened that was, that milky oats or omega-3s or magnesium is not going to address. And so just having the radar open, to think is something going on, like are my red flags raised? So even if they say like, oh no, everything's fine. And I'm not saying disbelieve your children, but I'm saying that a lot of people say everything is fine when it's not. And so how are we going to like look into that? Like, do we have a strategy? Do we have a plan? Are we going to ask once and they say, oh, no, everything's fine. We're like, okay, cool, everything's fine. We're going to have our eyes or ears open. Nowadays, I know from having kids and from knowing a whole lot of parents that there's lots of text messages going around and people are on Zoom calls and they're doing stuff over speakerphone, and I get that there's issues with kids privacy and boundaries and all that, but like keeping an ear open, just paying attention to that, I think it's really important because sometimes there's a big thing that could get missed.
Yeah. Well, we just hit the 2 hour mark, and I don't think we can possibly get through all of the other. I mean, I don't know. How long you want to stay talking, Jim?
Well, it can't be forever, but
Huh.
what we hit the 2 hour mark and we hit the end of the first page. Is that what I'm seeing here?
Pretty much, yeah.
Um,
Um,
oh, the vibrations thing is doubled.
yeah, there are a couple of doubles.
Uh, someone's asking about skullcap. We could do skullcap.
Can I do a little input on kids?
Sure, please.
I have a 12-year-old granddaughter, and she was being bullied and isolated by the whole class. And she wrote a note saying, "I'm going to kill Ruby," and got expelled, and all kinds of things happened. But the social worker did not step up, or the teacher, until this happened. But there are social justice programs in the schools now, and you have to know how to find the person that will push those.
Mhm.
And it did, it made a difference, and things have calmed down. But because she wrote that, all hell broke loose.
Right.
And it was just a bullying situation. She was one girl who used to be her friend, just totally isolated her and managed to isolate the whole class.
I mean that is such a common thing, and I think that I'm just vaguely, I can't see everyone, everyone's face here, but I think a lot of us, if we go back and we think about, our teenage years, we can either remember that happening to us or happening to someone we know. And so we can just assume it is still happening. It's probably common. And I don't want to, I don't want to like diss on teachers because I think about teachers as being like overworked and underpaid and not having the resources, but asking teacher at like talking to people in the schools if your child is in a school to get some input like, hey, is anything going on? Because I have friends that are teachers and they're like, oh yeah, I have a sense of what's going on, but like my job is to be the teacher. I'm not the social worker in the classroom and there's not enough resources, but you can get some leads there. It's just, I think the important thing is like something's going on and when you're like, I'm not sure I can figure out what it is. You know, we want to look into as many avenues as possible.
I just don't understand why teachers aren't like the best paid profession. Like
Right.
why don't we start teachers out at 100 grand a year, make it super competitive so like the best teachers are the ones educating our next generation? I just don't freaking understand why they're so poorly paid and overworked.
Yeah. Our priorities are definitely misplaced. It could make me frustrated and angry. I can have an outburst, which would make me think, oh, I should take some skull cap.
Okay, so last question then. Um, it was a skull. Okay, I recently come across American skullcap. I have blue vervain, mimosa, lemon balm, peppermint, and rosemary. I'd like to know what can be blended and used as a nerve tonic to replace pharmaceutical antidepressants.
I like the last sentence changes the dynamic there.
You want to ignore the last sentence and talk about
I
the
want to
steps?
I want to like say some stuff and then have a caveat because like the last sentence changes what I'll say about the first part. Um, I mentioned earlier about St. John's wort about like I think about St. John's wort as an individual plant with its own indications, but I also think about it as an aromatic plant. And then I think, what are aromatic plants good for? They're good for cloudy thinking and brain fog, which I saw was a indication, or a question, a comment in the chat. I think they're good for like feeling emotionally or mentally stuck and facilitating sort of like movement when you feel like overwhelmed and you don't know where to go and it kind of open up your perception so you can see different options. And then, although it doesn't apply to every single bitter nervine, because that would be too much to ask, I think a lot of bitter nervines for me are like in someone's response to a stressful situation, am I seeing like angst or frustration or irritability or anger and agitation? And for skullcap, like those would be indications. And I also think skullcap seems like you don't have to be like this for it to be the right herb to use. It's not like the only thing it's good for, but for people who like maybe they're more of a type A or choleric or pitta sort of disposition, and they've always been very high achieving, and they sort of like their sense of self is tied to their ability to achieve, and then they're like getting stressed out and they're struggling, and their response is like, I'm gonna kick the stress's ass, because that's what I do, and then they're like not able to, they're losing, and then they get more and more frustrated, and then they get to sort of like have a tantrum, scream, yell, swear, slam doors, cupboards, holler, just basically explode and have an outburst. Um, in which case they might feel like, oh, I got a release. Like I feel better after that. But if they're doing that in front of or around other people, or it's a pattern, it's impacting other people, then that just increases their stress, and it's not really fixing anything. I think that that sort of like frustration to the point of like needing to explode and then repeat process. If that's a pattern that I'm seeing, that's sort of like one of my key skull cap inclinations.
So, the rest of the question. There are absolutely herbs that can replace some pharmaceuticals. Not all of them. There are some pharmaceuticals that we don't have an herb that does anything similar. And using herbs in place of pharmaceuticals is a valid way to practice herbalism, but I think that it is not at all a comprehensive approach to practicing herbalism. And so there's a lot of nuance when it comes to talking about the depression and pharmaceuticals. Before I could answer that question, I would want to know, when did you experience your first depressive episode? What was it like? What has your experience since then been? Is it persistent? Does it come and go? Have you only had one and you were put on antidepressants and that was 30 years ago and you just have never had any issues with it since then? That type of thing happens. When you're depressed, what's your worst? What's your best? How long does each last? Which pharmaceuticals are you on? Which have you tried? What were their effects, good and bad? What types of social supports do you have in place? And a lot of these questions, I think, are really important because when people stop taking antidepressants, three things can occur. Number one is everything's good and remains good forever. But also, people can have withdrawals from some antidepressants that look like a depressive episode. And some people without withdrawals will have a depressive episode because that is the natural course of their depression. There's so much variability with depression. Like, if you experienced your first depressive episode before 20 and it was combined with severe anxiety, it's much more likely that your depression is going to be episodic and ongoing. If you don't experience your first depressive episode until you're 50 and it was in response to a parent passing, there's a very good chance that you'll only have one and it won't be a long-term persistent thing. So there's a lot that goes into considering these types of questions. They're not at all straightforward. What's the risk of stopping the antidepressant? Why do you want to stop it? I work with a lot of people and they say, I want to stop my antidepressant. And I say, what type of negative effects are you experiencing? And they say, none. And I say, are you at a time in your life where the risk of having a depressive relapse is an okay thing? Do you have support networks in place? Can you take time off work? Like for a lot of people, I think that coming off of an antidepressant is a potentially risky, maybe not to their health, but to their life type of thing. And it's something that I would recommend a lot of forethought and planning for if that's something that you're interested in. I think that herbs can help. Mimosa was mentioned. Mimosa, St. John's wort, Kanna, your serotonergics can pick up the slack a little bit if it's an SSRI that you're coming off of. But there's tapering considerations and cross tapers, and it's a lot. And so I don't have a good answer for what can be blended and used as a nerve tonic to replace pharmaceutical antidepressants. But I have a lot of good questions that if I had the answers to, I could maybe come up with a better response. So I guess I'll end with, I hope that you can find a good herbalist that can help you navigate this complexity.
Yeah, it is and I know not everyone can find this person because there's not enough of them, but there are people in the field of psychiatry who aren't just put people on drugs. There are people who will help adjust medications and really like do the teamwork partnering thing that we hope that all practitioners will do, but not all of them do. And if you can look around, ask around, reach out, ask questions to try to find that person, that can be pretty amazing. I know that what I prefer is that people have a practitioner who will help them appropriately get off of medications that they're taking and be able to like watch for stuff. And I've seen people that will their tapers take a lot longer, and that's not what anyone wants. It's usually like when people ask me like, how long should I taper off a drug? I'm like 6 months to a year. They're like, that's so long. I'm like, but doing it over a year is way better than trying it several times in a year and having terrible withdrawal episodes, because when that happens, it creates more anxiety and more stress and more fear that is going to compound. And if you can just say, a year seems like a long time. It is a long time. It's also not a long time. And if you can really slowly go down over a longer period of time, rather than try to go off because you just don't want to be on it and then risk a bad aggravation, whether it's withdrawal or return of the thing that the antidepressant was holding at bay. I think that, low and slow for the win is a strategy that I would take rather than I want to get off this thing as soon as possible. And if you don't know that person yet, ask around. If you're a practitioner, those are the referral people that we want to know about. To like, oh, who are the psychiatrists that really work with their clients. That if someone says like, you know, as Thomas said, like I got onto this medicine after maybe I lost a parent. And I think I don't need to take this for the rest of my life. How do I get off of it? Those people are really great. The people who are like, oh no, just take that forever. It's fine, or maybe not the greatest practitioners, but that I think is like stresses the importance of referrals to people who really excel in that area.
And there have been, so deprescribing is a growing movement, and there have been a couple of books in the past few years published on deprescribing psychiatric medications. I think that, yeah, there are a lot more resources out there now than there were 20 years ago, and finding the right folks to plug in with is the key. This has been fun. Anything you wanted to talk about tonight that we haven't, Jim?
We didn't talk about a whole ton of awesome, cool plants and everything.
I know. Do you want to talk about a few of them before we wrap it up?
Let me think if there's something that is like super unique and special. not commonly. There's too many things. There's too, like, I don't know if I can,
We should have
I'm
we should
I'm
have a
not good
mushroom conversation sometime.
being concise.
Yeah. Hmm. Well, thanks for hanging out and chatting about the nervous system and things that can go wrong with it, and herbs that can influence it.
Yeah, thanks so much to people who I recognize and people who I don't recognize. Hi.
Yeah, this has been a
I
great
haven't
round. Thanks everybody for asking such wonderful questions. And yeah, this is recorded. It will go up on the website. An email will go out once that happens, sometime in the next few days, probably. And Jim and I are teaching with a few other lovely folks down in Alabama next month, and we hope to do more of these free classes. So we'll catch you either online or in person sometime soon. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.
Have a great evening or afternoon, wherever you are.